Marco, would you like to start, please?
Good evening, bonsoir, buenas noches, and Europe, and good afternoon, United States, and good morning, Latin America. Thank you very much for joining us tonight to the second conference of the Beyond Memory program, launched by PH.D. last year. And we are very happy to continue this program during 2021, and hopefully we'll have more conferences and sessions to propose you also for the 2022 program. For tonight, I want to thank Albert, who is responsible for organizing all this program during the fall of 2021, and also to my team, Greta and William, who are joining us tonight. And we are very happy and honored to have Dr. Struve, who is going to talk to us tonight. So welcome everybody, and thank you for being with us.
So, and just to give you some information about the historian Kai Struve, our guest, Dr. Kai Struve, earned a PhD in modern history from University of Berlin and an MA in modern history, philosophy, and political science from the same university. He is the author of the books Peasants and Nation in Galicia, on Belonging and Social Emancipation in the 19th century, and Deutsche Herrschaft, Ukrainischer Nationalismus, Antijüdische Gewalt, der Sommer 1941 in der Westukraine. Also of several articles on nationalism and anti-Semitism in East Central Europe during the 19th and 20th century. Dr. Struve has also delivered lectures at universities and written several conferences and papers on such topics. So today the subject is the German-Soviet war and violence against Jews in Western Ukraine in summer 1941. And yeah, I'm glad to listen now to Dr. Struve and getting more insights on this really important subject. So Dr. Struve, it's up to you. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for this kind introduction and for inviting me to have the possibility to present here some results of my book on the summer of 1941 that you mentioned in the introduction. I have prepared a presentation as part of my talk, and I will try to start it now. I'm not sure if it's,
yes.
It's, now it works. Okay, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me well. If not, you should complain. Yes, I will start now with my talk. During the first days and weeks after the German attack of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, the Jews in the newly occupied territories were hit by violence and murder from two sides. These were early mass executions by the German police, primarily the so-called Einsatzgruppen of the security police, but there were also many acts of violence and murder from the side of the local population that usually are described as pogroms. These acts of violence from local side took place primarily in the western borderlands of the Soviet Union, that is those territories between the Baltic and the Black Sea that had been annexed by the Soviet Union only in September 1939 or June 1940. For the last 2 decades, the discussion of the violence from local side has been strongly influenced by Jan Tomasz Gross's book on the town of Jedwabne in northeastern Poland that you see here also in the presentation. On the one hand, Gross' book and the following debate have produced important new insights, especially with respect to relations between Jews and non-Jews in the period of Soviet occupation of these regions after September 1939, and on the increase in anti-Semitism in this period. On the other hand, it seems to have also reinforced some, in my view, rather problematic assumptions about the character of violence from local side in summer 1941, both for the Polish and for the other territories. Ross' study emphasized an image of this violence as a largely spontaneous, murderous, and massive outbreak of anti-Semitic hatred, where, as he summarized his description on the events in Jedwabne, half of the population murdered in the other half, referring to the fact that about one half of Jedwabne's inhabitants were Christians and the other half Jewish. The critical point here is that such a generalization, in fact, distracts from looking for answers about who the actual perpetrators were and what their political and organizational background was. In fact, local attempts of extermination of the whole Jewish population in towns, as in Jedwabne, were rare exceptions among the large number of localities where acts of violence against Jews took place in these regions. A closer examination clearly shows that in localities where acts of violence took place without direct German participation, the actual perpetrators were smaller, usually smaller organized groups whose actions are not adequately described as a spontaneous outbreak, but the violence usually consisted of pre-planned targeted killings of certain individuals and families by insurgent groups as part of a change of rule. Deadly violence on a larger scale took place only if such insurgent groups or German forces were involved. For all these regions between the Baltic and the Black Sea, but with the notable exception of Western Belarus, the German military intelligence and the Abwehr cooperated with groups of a nationalist anti-Soviet underground organizations in these regions and coordinated with them the beginning of uprising behind Soviet lines for the date when the German would attack the Soviet Union. And that is the key context also for this anti-Jewish violence from local side. A key controversial question regarding the development of these attacks on Jews from local side in these regions during the first week after the German attack of the Soviet Union here is if these pogroms or the mass murder of Jews with local participation and had been planned before, or to which extent these local groups acted when they committed acts of violence against Jews on German orders that they had received before the 22nd of June 1941. I will discuss these questions now on the example of Western Ukraine, or more precisely Eastern Galicia, where most of my case study that I described more extensively in the book on 1941 come from. And but I will start now at the beginning, the first of my part of my talk, with a discussion of German and Ukrainian preparation and plans before the attack of the Soviet Union. For the question of a German preparation of pogroms, a central document is the often cited cable that Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, sent to the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen on the 29th of June 1941. Here he ordered his police forces to support secretly self-cleansing activities of anti-communist and anti-Jewish circuits in the newly occupied territories, and to instigate as the letter here continues, local pogroms. In this letter, he referred to a meeting with officers from the Einsatzgruppen on the 17th of June 1941, that means some days before the German attack, where he had given similar instructions. In fact, there are more documents that show that there was a widespread expectation on the German side that violent reckonings with Jews and communists, as many of these documents say it, will take place when Soviet armed forces will have left the territories. Generally, this was seen favorably on the German side. But there are no further documents that indicate any kind of concrete preparation. Apparently, Heydrich sent the cable 1 week after the beginning of this letter to the Einsatzgruppen 1 week after the beginning of the German attack. That means on the 29th of June 1941, because he, and most likely also Heinrich Himmler, believed that so far the Einsatzgruppen had put too less effort in instigating pogroms. This would also indicate that there had not been any thorough planning and preparation, except for the discussion on the meeting on this 17th of June 1941. And another argument against the joint planning and preparation of pogroms from German and Ukrainian side consists of the fact that the instigations of pogroms was an aim of the German police forces, but that cooperation with the nationalist insurgent forces in the back of the Soviet army had been part of the Wehrmacht and not of the German security police's part of preparations of the war. The Wehrmacht had, the German armed forces had, with some interruptions, already cooperated with the most important militant nationalist Ukrainian force, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and its predecessors since the 1920s. A certain crisis in this cooperation had occurred in the year 1940, when the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, split in two parts, one under the leadership of Stepan Bandera and the other under the previous leadership of Andrei Melnik. As a result of the split, the Melnik group lost the support of the underground organization in the Soviet territories and also most of the support among Ukrainians in the German-occupied Polish territories. Though the Germans, the Abwehr, the German military intelligence, rather preferred cooperation with Melnik, they started during the months before the attack of the Soviet Union during the first half of 1941, also a cooperation with the Bandera group, because only the Bandera group was able to provide intelligence from the Soviet territories, and more importantly, they had an underground organization in these territories that was able to mobilize several thousand insurgents who should become active with the German attack of the Soviet Union. And the other argument against the fact that here was also a background for a preparation of pogroms is that there was a deep mutual distrust between the Bandera OUN and the German security police. The German security police considered Bandera's group to be too independent, while at the same time the Bandera group feared that the German police forces were hostile, or one of the most hostile forces on the German side, against their plans of state building. And the plans for state building were their central aim and also their central motive for the cooperation with the Germans. And this was different with the German army, where there were some people and some influential people also who were rather and especially among the Abwehr, who were rather in favor of a stronger support of a form of Ukrainian state building. Yes, but at the same time, there was also some, in contrast to the Bandera group, there was some cooperation of the German security police with the Melnik OUN. But as I mentioned already before, the Melnik group had lost nearly all contacts into the Soviet territory of Eastern Galicia and Volhynia during the year 1940 as a result of the split in the organization. And the consequence was that that German institution, the security police that had the aim of instigating pogroms, cooperated with an Ukrainian organization that had nearly no connections into the Ukrainian underground, in the Soviet territories, at least not into the Eastern Galicia and Volhynia. And therefore, prior to the German attack, would not have been able to prepare any violence against Jews. On the other hand, that Ukrainian organization that had strong underground forces in these territories cooperated with the Abwehr, the German military intelligence, but the German army had other tasks and priorities than preparing acts of anti-Jewish violence. But at the same time, both the Germans and the Ukrainian nationalists shared the view of Jews as main supporters and beneficiaries of Soviet rule, both in general and especially for the period of after 1939, when these Western territories of the Soviet Union had been occupied by Soviet troops. And that perception of Jews as supporters and beneficiaries of Soviet rule was the basis for the beginning of mass executions of Jews by the German police forces after the 22nd of June in the newly occupied territories. They had no general order for the extermination of the whole Jewish population, but early mass executions and also their quick extension during the first weeks of the war largely resulted from an anti-Semitic image of Jews as a core group of the Bolshevik enemy. In a letter to the Einsatzgruppen on the 1st of July, Heydrich explicitly wrote, it is obvious that and it's a quote, it is obvious that the cleansing activities, that means executions, have to extend first of all to the Bolsheviks and Jews. But most of the Bolsheviks had fled before the Germans arrived, but most of the Jews had stayed. Until the end of July, the German police units mostly only shot Jewish males, primarily from the intelligentsia, because they were seen as an especially pro-Soviet force and as a security risk. But the view of Jews as supporters and beneficiaries of Soviet rule had spread widely also among the non-Jewish population in the territories that had been occupied by the Soviet Union in 1939 and 1940. And that was a view that was also shared shared by the Ukrainian nationalists. In May 1941, the leadership of the Bandera OUN wrote down extensive instructions for the beginning of the German-Soviet war, their plans how to act when the Germans would attack, and distributed that under the title, Barat by Dialnes Pichasvini, the struggle and activities of the OUN in wartime. Here they described as the OUN's main aim to establish local administrations and militias in localities where the Soviet troops were about to leave as soon as possible, and preferable before German troops arrived. This should provide the basis for Ukrainian state building and demonstrate to the Germans the strength of the Ukrainians' will and ability to establish such a state. One of the tasks that the Bandera OUN assigned here to its combat groups and local militias was to cleanse the territories from enemy forces. That means not only from remnants of Soviet troops and the NKVD officials, but also from more generally from supporters of Soviet rule. A number of documents show that also within the OUN, primarily Jews were seen as the central group of Bolshevist supporters. But also with respect to the foundation of a Ukrainian nation state, that was what was the main aim of the OUN, Jews were rather considered to be an undesirable group. The head of the Bandera OUN's underground structures in the Soviet territories, Ivan Klimev, interpreted the task of cleansing the territory from enemy forces in an especially radical way. In a leaflet signed by him and widely distributed in Western Ukraine in July 1941, he instructed, among others, his readers called them. This is sentence that I have also in this quoted here, and the first quote on the slide. People know Moscow, Poland, the Hungarians, Jews that are your enemies. Destroy them. But even more important. But even more important may have been another document. Here, Klimev introduced military revolutionary tribunals with the right to issue the death penalty and also collective responsibility of families and nations for all offenses against the Ukrainian army and state. And this was the framework of orders and instructions that the local and regional organizations of the OUN, that was the basis for the activities of the local and regional organizations of the OUN after the German attack of the Soviet Union. When in these days after the 22nd of June 1941, in nearly all towns and villages in Eastern Galicia, the OUN insurgents transformed the underground structures, groups, and combat groups that existed there, transformed into or initiated the establishment of local militias. That means local police forces they had a core role in this change of rule from Soviet to that what they expected to become the basis for a Ukrainian nation state. And they organized not only this local militias, but had also an important role in the formation of new local administrations that were, as the militias, then usually accepted by the German military authorities. And these new local militias and new local administrations were then only screened by the Germans and also by the German police forces, and partially replaced after August 1941. Yeah, and another important factor is that played a role also during in this initial phase of the German occupation was that when the Soviets or before the Soviets retreated during the last days of June 1941, they murdered a large number of prison inmates in these regions, and especially in Western Ukraine. Here it was discovered that they had murdered probably up to 10,000 inmates of a number of prisons in Eastern Galicia, and several thousand more in the northern region of Volhynia. This had a strong impact on the population, but it confirmed also some existing images about the Soviets on the German side, and was also immediately taken up by German propaganda. And the German police forces, most importantly for these regions, the Einsatzgruppe C, that moved immediately into the region after the German troops, They used this, or for them, these Soviet atrocities provided also a kind of legitimization for their own initial mass executions. And I have here put here on this slide these first larger mass executions by German police forces in the regions, and they in the German documents you always find them legitimized in context of this Soviet prison massacres, and Jews were and they were presented as a reprisal for these prison massacres, and Jews were in a way identified as a group that group that were at the center of responsibility for Soviet rule, and thereby also for Soviet crimes. I would like to continue now with some remarks on Lviv, the Lemberg, the Western Ukrainian capital, because events here had a strong impact or were rather important also for the view of local pogroms, violence later. But at the same time, though it had a strong influence on later images of the violence, in fact, it was only typical for some other places, not for violence against Jews with local participation in general. Nevertheless, I think this Lviv case is important because it can exemplify a lot of aspects that were important here. When German troops entered the city in the early morning of the 30th of June 1941, without meeting any significant resistance by Soviet troops, they were greeted by enthusiastic inhabitants, as it happened more or less everywhere in Western Ukraine. The prisons were among the buildings they moved to immediately after entering the city, and here they found a large number of murdered inmates. That means, as it could be later established, probably between 2,500 and 2,700. In the morning of this day, the 30th of June, the OUN created a local militia from its underground fighters and volunteers. At the same time, Bandera's deputy, Yaroslav Stetsko, arrived in the city. During the day, Stetsko prepared the announcement of a Ukrainian state. At the evening of that day, that was then at the same day, Stetsko declared the foundation of a Ukrainian state and the formation of a Ukrainian government. And he did this despite the German side had repeatedly forbidden such a step. During the following weeks, this step and Bandera's and Stetsko's refusal to revoke this declaration, however, led to the termination of cooperation between the Germans and the Bandera group. And then already after some days, the arrest of Bandera and Stetsko, and later also to mass arrests among the followers in September 1941 and later. In the afternoon of the 30th of June, the German army commanders had ordered to retrieve the corpses from the cells and mass graves in the prisons in order to allow the population to search for the relatives among the dead. Presumably, the German military commander, the city's commander, assigned to the Ukrainian militia the task of providing workers for retrieving the body. It was for retrieving the bodies. It was one of the usual procedures of the German army to oblige primarily Jews to all clearing and other works that it had, and other works after it had occupied a certain locality. The number of Jews brought to the prison in the afternoons of 30th of June was still small, and no major acts of violence are reported for these hours. A much larger roundup of Jews started in the morning of the 1st of July. And this was then the central context of the program violence that unfolding during the 1st of July. Members of the militia or civilians who joined the militia in these activities took Jews from the streets or from their apartments and brought them to the prisons individually or in groups in much larger numbers than the number of workers actually needed for the work. When arrested and led through the streets, Jews were derided, beaten, or mistreated in other ways. A number of them were killed here or at the prisons. The central place of violence were the 3 prisons in Lviv where the Jews were brought to, and also the streets surrounding them. And this is a photo that has been made in front of one of the prisons. And here on the right side, there is also, you can see a member of the militia, and it is possible to identify this man as member of the militia because of this badge at his arm. Yes, and this is one very well often reproduced image photo from one of the prison yards from this prison at the Ulica Łąckiego. And here in the center of this image, you can see these 2 people in the middle are probably relatives of inmates who are searching for their people among the dead. Then in the front, you see the corpses of murdered inmates that had been brought by Jews into the yard of the prison and laid out there. And in the back, you see this the large group of Jews that had been brought to this prison and had been forced to sit down there in this yard. And this is more or less a similar scene of the same prison yard from a different perspective, from this perspective from above, from a house on the street adjacent to this prison yard. It is very likely, though there's no direct evidence, that the Einsatzgruppe C contributed in fulfillment of Heydrich's pogrom order of 2 days before to the fact that a much larger number of Jews were brought to the prisons than the number of workers actually needed for retrieving the corpses. Sonderkommando 4B, a part of Einsatzgruppe C, had entered Lviv about noon of 30th of June. And the rest of larger parts of the Einsatzgruppe, together with its commander, the Brigadeführer Rasch, and his staff arrived in the early morning of the 1st of July. But also the events of this day show that anti-Semitic emotions existed not only among the city's inhabitants, but to a high degree also among some German units. The largest single murder case of that day was committed by members of the Einsatzgruppe. They shot at least 50 and maybe up to 100 Jews in the yard of one of the prisons, the Brigitki prisons. There are also clear indications that members of the Einsatzgruppe encouraged local people in the Ukrainian militia to abuse and mistreatment of Jews in the prison yards. For the most part, the violence ended in the late afternoon or evening of 1st of July, when, according to witnesses, German officers appeared in the prisons and ordered the release of the surviving Jews. Yes, these are two other photos also from the context of the pogrom, that these images are very well known. They are part of a series of, I think, about 20 photos that had been made by German war reporters, as most of the photos that we have from this context. And they, yes, were already published for the first time in the 1960s, and then also as these and some other photos from this context, many of them with naked women in the front of in the third prison in Lviv, in front of the Sommer prison. They had been reproduced and published then also in many times in the following years, and they in a way had a strong influence on the whole interpretation of this anti-Jewish violence, not only for Lviv but also for other regions. As I said, it is rather the violence on the streets in Lviv largely ended on the evening of the 1st of July. There have been different estimates regarding the number of victims. In the research literature, often numbers of victims are quoted that of about 4,000 victims, or sometimes even 7,000 victims. In my view, that is, and you can find also at least mostly the number of 4,000 victims also in a number of memoirs of testimonies of surviving Jews. However, according to my conclusions, this is a number that is with respect to this events of 1st of July is much too high. The rather likely estimate is, and it is extremely difficult to give a very clear, or the sources do not allow for a very precise, for giving a very precise number of victims, but my estimate is that there were several hundred victims, and that this number of 4,000 that, as I said, you can find in some sources, refers rather results or gives the number of Jewish victims of different episodes of violence that happened in this city during the whole of July. And that was not only this pogrom of 1st of July, but also a mass execution by Einsatzgruppe C on 5th of July that had probably, but also here the numbers are very difficult to establish, about 2,000 victims. And these so-called and also often misinterpreted so-called Petelura days of 25th and 26th of July, where about 1,500 Jews were shot again, as on the 5th of July, by the German security police. And in the research literature, these Petelura days sometimes are presented as a second pogrom, similar to that on the 1st of July. But in fact, they did not resemble the events of the 1st of July, but as I said, the mass execution of the 5th of July. Here, during these so-called Petelura days, probably about 2,000 Jews were brought by the Ukrainian militia to the prison at the Ulica Wonskiego and kept there for about one day and night. They were beaten heavily by the militia and the German police, and finally most of them were transported out of the city and shot by the German security police near a village at the outskirts of Lviv. Yes, I would like to conclude now with some words about the different contexts of violence, in anti-Jewish violence and murder in other localities in this period. And one context was very similar to that what I have described now for Lviv. That means the retrieval of murdered prison inmate. And I've listed here a number of exemplary cases where the very similar events took place, similar in this respect that here also the context that here the massacres in prisons had taken place, and in Zambia, Borislav, and Drohobych, Jews were forced to retrieve also here the corpses, and this was a context obviously also encouraged by the Germans, at least in Zambia and Borislav. This was a context of violence, but this was not it was not the case that in every place where larger Soviet massacre had taken place, also violence and pogroms of Jews took place. This was different in these other places, Stanislav and Zhokwa. Here also Soviet massacres and large numbers of murdered prison inmates were found, but no Jews were killed, and probably because in these places Jews were not forced to retrieve these corpses from the prisons. Another example, another context, and that is a context is this executions and so to speak punishment of enemies by the OUN militias or combat units. As I mentioned already in the beginning, the OUN's instructions from May 1941 allowed for the liquidation of activists of enemy nationalities. That means Russians, mostly Russian Poles and Jews. Ivan Klimov's leaflets had radicalized these instructions even more. And that was the central context of deadly violence in many villages and small towns that German or Hungarian troops that had occupied the southeastern part of Galicia did not control really at that time. This violence appears in the research literature and also sometimes in memoirs of surviving Jews as pogroms. But usually they were not spontaneous outbreaks of violence, but rather pre-planned targeted killings of selected people, mostly but not only Jews. Also Ukrainians who had supported Soviet rule as officials in the village administrations, as kolkhoz activists, or who allegedly had cooperated with the NKVD could be punished, as well as Poles who were considered to be enemies of the Ukrainian state. However, acts of violence against Ukrainians usually were milder and less deadly. While among Ukrainians, only certain individuals were killed, in the case of Jews, often whole families were murdered. The forms and scale of violence, also in this context, in different localities, but in different localities differed significantly. So, for example, in one village in Ditchkiv near Ternopil, a firing squad of local OUN activists shot about 10 Jewish males, but there were no killings of Ukrainians or Poles. In another village, Pervoloka near Buchach, local OUN activists executed probably 8 or 9 Ukrainians, 1 or 2 Jews, and killed 1 Jewish family. In other places, for example, the small towns of Ulashkivtsi and Otynia, several dozen Jews were killed from a Jewish population of several hundred, or about 1,000. Though some Jewish memoirs describe the events here as pogroms in the sense of a spontaneous wild outbreak of excessive violence, In fact, and other descriptions suggest that they have been rather targeted killings of a number of Jewish families by organized local groups of their own. Nevertheless, there were also places where these liquidation of enemies by the own groups and the activities of so-called courts of the Ukrainian nationalists apparently resulted also into the attempt of killing all Jews in a certain locality, as this was the case in the village of Kosev near Charkiv or Nesvisko, west of Horodenka. And another context, and often a very important context, and often to a certain or large degree rather surprisingly overlooked in previous research, are violent events that could be in a way described as German pogroms. That means excessive violent excesses by the parts of the Waffen-SS division Viking. These events in these places had a much higher number of Jewish victims than in other places where violence of this kind took place. And this unit of the Waffen-SS belonged to the combat troops and was subordinated to the army. That means it had not indifference, it had not police tasks, in difference to the Einsatzgruppen or the other police units of the order police. And parts of this Viking division had a central role in the violent excesses in Solochiv, Sporiv, Ozernach, Rebailev, Skalat, and above all in Ternopil. In all these places, also local militias of the ONB and inhabitants participated in the violence, but the large number of victims clearly is the result of the involvement of the Waffen-SS. These Waffen-SS units combed through the cities and towns in search of Jewish men and shot them where they found them, like on a hunting expedition, as a Jewish survivor described what he saw in Ternopil. Or they assembled them at certain places and shot them there. And here the death toll was extremely high. While, for example, in Lviv, the share of the city's Jewish population that were killed during this pogrom on the 1st of July was clearly below 0.5% of the population. Also in Borislav, where a rather high number of killings took place, it did not exceed 2 to 3%. In these places, it was among 8 to 30% of the Jewish population. And that means that, in fact, the violence here had a totally different character from the other localities. Yes. As a conclusion, I come now to a conclusion with 3 points. I believe that it can be clearly said there was no uniform pogrom story, as it had been suggested sometimes in previous research, but that the anti-Jewish violence consisted of very different segments that were interconnected, but that were, however, interconnected mostly by the view of Jews as supporters and beneficiaries of Soviet rule. And the second point is that I believe that an understanding of the deadly violence against Jews from the side, that means in the case of Eastern Galicia, mostly from Ukrainian side, as a massive spontaneous outbreak of anti-Semitic hatred can only be a part of, but not a comprehensive explanation of that violence. The violence was also part of a change of rule and of the attempts of insurgent groups of state building. This is evident not only for the Ukrainian territories, but also for other regions in the Soviet Western borderlands. The only exceptions here are the mostly Belarusian territories, where there were only a very small number of deadly attacks on Jews. Apparently, the reason is that there was no Belarusian anti-Soviet insurgency and no organized nationalist underground that took over local power and conducted reckonings with those they considered to be Soviet supporters or traitors. And a close examination of the different acts of violence also reveals that ascriptions of emotional outbreaks of anti-Semitic hatred to the Eastern Europeans, in contrast to the German perpetrators, seems to be rather more based on some stereotypical images than on a factual analysis of the events in 1941. Thank you very much.
Dr. Struve, so thank you very much for your presentation. And maybe before giving the possibility to our audience to ask you some questions, I would like to ask Father de Bois maybe to give some insights of his research in the Rif region on the pogroms. Father de Bois, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, thank you.
So I would like to say that when we were on the ground in the villages that you mentioned, all these pogroms or non-pogroms, all these attacks against civilians were the most difficult place to investigate. I think especially about Zolochiv, where they completely deny it happened and they recognize on the ground only 75 victims. And we tried and tried and tried many times to find witnesses. It was extremely difficult, even to find somebody who say that it happened. And for the pogrom in Lviv, it's the same. I found only one man was present at the pogrom because his father was killed in the jail, and he was looking for the corpse of his father. And he recognized also what happened directly, but generally it's not recognized. I would raise a question. According to your study, it's very, very interesting. What is the percentage of victims at the beginning of the war for Soviet Union among Jews, non-Jews? I think especially about the communists, but also the Polish. Did they kill also any Polish? Because it was the beginning of to send the Polish away, or other people like the Roma, because I found also places where they killed the Roma for a reason I ignore at the very beginning. So what is, in your advice, the percentage, and could we consider these attacks as the beginning of the genocide of the Jews? Or is it finally something with a little bit apart, because it's part, as you say, as an outbreak of nationalist violence?
Yes, shall I answer immediately or?
Yes, please.
Yes, I'm not sure if I understood the first question correctly. The question was about the percentage of victims of this violence from the nationalist side, which percent, how many Jews and how many are from others? Was that the question?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not able to give an answer to this because my focus and my interest was in the question of context and reasons of anti-Jewish violence. When I looked into the smaller places, I found many information and hints on about violence and murder non-Jews. But that is an issue that is totally uninvestigated, I will say. So I have a lot of examples from villages where, as I said, some villages were I gave you these different examples. These villages where only Jews were killed. In other villages, you have reports that about half of the victims were Jews, and the other half some Ukrainians, sometimes also Poles. But I would say that clearly the majority. In small towns, it's clear the majority is Jews. In the villages, I'm not able to give a clear an assessment because I could also not do. There are not sources about that. You can only have exemplary cases, and you have exemplary sources about exemplary cases. My assumption is that there was more violence, and a lot of violence also where we don't have really sources about, and it's difficult to investigate, and it has not really investigated yet. Yes, the second question, I think it's important, it's interesting. It's if this should be considered the beginning of the Holocaust. It was clearly a part of the Holocaust, but as far as the local activists, the ON, the local nationalists here and also in the other regions were involved, their motives were somewhat different. They were clearly motivated by anti-Semitic stereotypes, but their core aim was the establishment of their own nation states. It had been either in the Baltic countries destroyed by also in a certain degree in the Polish case destroyed by the Soviets, or they helped to finally to establish it as in the Ukrainian case. So this is clearly is very strongly rooted in the nationalist tensions in the region that existed before. It is clearly also very strongly rooted in some anti-Semitic stereotypes, but I don't want to give a final answer to the question if this, to which extent it's clearly also in the context of the Holocaust, but it's also something different.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Struve. Maybe we start with some questions. I saw that Mr. Westermann has a question for you. So please.
Thank you, Albert, and thank you, Dr. Struve, for your presentation. My question relates to the OON guideline from May 1941 that you showed on your slide. And one of the targets of the Ukrainians was listed as aliens, and specifically Asians who were trying to checkerboard Ukraine. And that very much parrots some Nazi ideology with respect to the Wehrmacht of the Asiatische Gewalt, for example, that was used. So I'd be interested in knowing where that Asian term came from, if you have any ideas about how that was included in the document. And just a very quick second question on the Waffen-SS Division Viking. Do we know if the leadership was involved in promoting those large-scale actions that you saw, or did that take place at lower unit levels in more spontaneous? Thank you.
Yes, yes. The OON clearly was regarding your first question about these Asians that appeared there. The OON was clearly part of this radical nationalist movements of this radical nationalist current that you have in many European countries. They had a very complex relationship with the Germans, as I tried to indicate at some points. But they had very clearly also under the influence of ideological currents in the German National Socialist regime. That is the one point that, and this can probably, maybe you can find it also here. One of their already older accusations of or in their view, their main enemies were the Russians or the Muscovites, as they call them. And one of the large struggle that they, in their view, existed and they had to face was also with the Russian influence in the Ukrainian territories. And one part also of this Russian influence were Jews who were assimilated rather to the Russian language, but also immigration of Russians or others from other part of the Soviet Union into Ukrainian territories. I think that are the context and backgrounds of these instructions. I don't think that there are any direct German influence on these instructions because they rather tended to keep that secret to the Germans. Probably the Germans know about that, but it was not made something. They wrote there a lot of things the Germans did not like very much regarding their strategy for state building. Yes, the other question is regarding these atrocities of the Viking division. I think clearly the commands of this unit did know about them, and also the Wehrmacht commander, the higher structures of the Wehrmacht did know about it. At the same time, when this large massacre in Ternopil took place, the army, in German it's the Army Corps, the command of the Army Corps, where the Viking division belonged to, was stationed at the outskirts of the city. And you have also different commands in the whole region, also in Zolochiv. It is also very clear that after this had happened, there was some attempts to hide it, to remove any mention, to not have it in the files of the army, I'm not able to answer the question if there were some orders from the division command, for example, from the commander of the division, or if it happened something it was something that happened on the lower levels. But it clearly took place also in agreement or in consent with some parts of the army, the local army commanders in the city. There were also some protests from the side of the army, but only later.
So I also see that Alessandro Mata from Italy has a question for Kai Struve, so please.
Thank you, Albert. Thank you, Professor Struve, for your very interesting conference. And my question is about, also by me, about the own directives and about the document from Ivan Klimis that you shown. It is written, the Poles, the Jews, the Russians, the Muscovites, and the Hungarians are our enemies. And my question, it was about why also the Hungarians are the targets in this document. Why? It is a sort of heritage from the period of Austro-Hungaric Empire, where also the Ukrainian territories were in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And it is for this that also the Hungarians are the targets in these documents from Klimis, or why? Why also the Hungarians?
Yeah. Yes, I think that is a very specific thing. The Hungarians probably appear there because of the events in Subcarpathia in 1938 and 1939. These parts, these most eastern parts of Czechoslovakia, after the Munich Agreement, were mostly were in two steps occupied or annexed by the Hungarians. And at the same time, after the Munich Agreement, also with some German support, there had taken place also the kind of first attempt of the Ukrainian state building strongly under the influence of the OUN. And that was then suppressed, also violently suppressed by the Hungarians, and many of the Ukrainian nationalists that had been arrested by Hungarians, etc. And I think that is the reason why the Hungarians, probably the reason why the Hungarians appear here in this document, though it is in the whole context, it's not a very, rather not a very important and kind of rather irritating point that does not explain much.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Steve wants to know if your research can also be been written up in a book, Dr. Struve. Is your book on the violence in Eastern Galicia also already available in English, or do we have to learn German?
Yeah, I think hopefully it will soon appear in Ukrainian, but there's no plans for translating it into English. I published some articles that are summarizing some of the results.
And so for those of you who are interested in reading your articles, where can we find them, or is there a possibility to read them somewhere?
Yes. Maybe I can send you a list of articles later. I don't think that it makes sense now to.
No, okay. So you can write to me or to Gerhard an email, and so I will put you into contact with Dr. Struve concerning the articles. Maybe one last question. I saw that someone wanted to know maybe your personal interest or motivation to work on the anti-Jewish violence. Maybe some last words on this question.
Yes, I once started a research project rather on this Soviet occupation on the Eastern Polish territories, and on the relations between Jews and non-Jews in the region. That was also related with this complex relationship of Jews and communist rule, and the stereotypical identification of Jews with Bolsheviks, and that is the background from which this further research on the Ukrainian case developed, because I had already before an interest in this region, and on also an interest in the history of Polish and Ukrainian nationalism in this region.
Okay. So thank you very much, Dr. Struve, for your presentation. I think we learned a lot tonight on this really interesting subject. For everyone who has questions to me or maybe to Dr. Struve, I will send you the Behind Memory email address, so don't hesitate to contact us if you have any further questions. And yeah, once again to Dr. Struve for his presentation, and to all the participants of today's lecture. And we will contact you for our next presentation, next lecture by Esther Safran-Foer on 11th November on her new book. So thank you very much, and good night or good day to everyone, wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bonsoir à tous le monde.